All right, we're continuing on in chapter 4. And I know this has been a kind of super heavy, dense chapter full of lots of theories. I just think it's important you can see the background and progression of anthropological thought in the modern period. And we'll just keep continuing on, and then I'll see how we're doing when we finish chapter 4. And we may press on into chapter 5, or we may just call it a day. I'll see how we're all doing at that point. All right. So I think we left off with Radcliffe Brown and equilibrium. And I was discussing different ways cultures and societies use to bring about equilibrium. And we talked about avoidance and joking techniques. So those are some of the ways it's done. The next guy, next broad category is called general evolution. And this dominated in anthropology departments from the 1940s to the 1960s. And this is interesting because when I was in school, I took physical anthropology at my community college, and it was definitely the bastion of evolutionary thought and thinking. So even though the class was on anthropology, the study of man, we didn't even begin to talk about modern humans until after the midterm. The whole first part of the class, we started with the great apes, and then we talked about proto-humans and all the different variations and the evolutionary development of man. And so it's not necessarily even the hard sciences like biology, geology, chemistry, physics, but it's in anthropology that we really find the concentration of especially Darwinian evolutionary thought, and then its more modern forms. So first guy out the chute is called Leslie White. And he believed the major purpose of technology is to capture and harness energy. Societies can be evaluated by their technology, which leads to other forms of cultural change and worldviews. Okay. General observance of the progression of hunter-gatherers to technological societies and how their control of energy through tools changed their cultures. All right, so let me try to break that down into more common language. So basically in this general evolution sort of framework, they're looking at tool use as a marker for how evolved or advanced a people group is. So they're basically applying Darwinian ethics onto human societies. And they see some societies as very simple and others as extremely complex. And so the simpler the society, they would assume that you're less evolved, less advanced than the more technologically sophisticated societies. Now, obviously, the anthropologists coming up with these theories are coming from the most technologically advanced societies in the world of their day. And so it makes sense they would put themselves on top, right? And then assume that people that didn't have their equivalent of technology were less developed or less evolved than them. And this got really elaborate. And I was a history major in my undergrad. And whenever I would get an ancient history book, often it would start not even with human beings, but actually with proto-humans. And then it would show how they went through this process. So once again, I wish I had my whiteboard so I could draw this, but I'm just gonna do it with my hands for you. So we start with the most basic. Modern humans, we're talking anywhere from 2 million to 800,000 years ago is the time frame the authors of the book are using. Very different from the Genesis account. I believe in the Jewish Orthodox calendar, this is the year 5779 or 5780. If someone wants to Google that for me, I'd like to know what year is it in the Jewish Orthodox calendar. Anyways, big difference if you're thinking humans have been here 6,000 years or if you think they've been here 2 million years in our modern state of being. So from the secular humanist or Darwinian anthropological perspective, we start very simple with hunter-gatherers. And so these people are like nomadic or semi-nomadic. They're traveling around and they're living off nuts, berries, roots, or they're hunting game. Then they believed after 800,000 years of this, around, and they have different dates. Some of them believe domestication took place up to 18,000 years ago. We definitely know it began 3,500 years ago because we have written records of it at that time. But before that, we have to infer from archaeological finds and remains because we didn't have written records before somewhere around 3,500 BC. Okay, so we go from hunter-gatherers to first what's called horticulture. And horticulture is the domestication of plants. And they might clear a section, but they've somehow made the connection that if you plant the seeds in the ground, or you notice that where you pooped after eating a certain type of prickly pear, cactus, or blackberry, or peach, that there's now prickly pear bushes or blackberry bushes growing where your poop spot is. And so they make this connection, hey, if we put some seeds in, maybe when we travel through this area next spring or next summer, there'll be more fruit plants. And so horticulture is the simplest type of domestication. There's not irrigation or tool use necessarily or fertilizers. It's simply you're making that connection that, hey, we can select certain plants and try to get them to grow into the future. Following this development, we have pastoralism, which is the domestication of animals. And some of the earliest animals domesticated would have been the dog, chickens, camels, horse, sheep, goats, pigs, and these were domesticated in different parts of the world. And it makes sense, right? So you're out with your homeboys on this hunt, and you kill some like 2,000-pound wild ox, and it has a calf there, and instead of killing the calf and having to carry it back to camp as well, someone says, hey, let's put a rope or a vine or something and lead it back and we'll keep it. And so if hard times come in the future and we're not able to hunt because of the weather or we're too weak or whatever, we'll have this calf we're raising and we can butcher that and eat that. And so domestication happens first of plants and then of animals. And then from there we get to a more involved type of domestication of plants, and this is called agriculture. And in an agrarian society, they're actually turning over the soil, they're irrigating, they're fertilizing, there's tool use, there's hybridization of seeds. I mean, if you look at something like corn, which is such a common part of our American diet, or maize, there is no wild corn growing. It's all domesticated, and it was taken from a plant that was like a grass-like seeds, and over the millennia, now we have huge, maybe foot-long ears of corn with huge kernels, and it provides a great source of food. But this came from human domestication of a grass seed type plant to our modern version of corn today. It is with agrarian cultures, they're obviously going to be sedentary because you can't take your crops and trees with you. And so this is where our first villages and then towns and cities begin to emerge. And because there is so much stable food supply, they're able to specialize in their labor. And so now, think of a hunter-gatherer group. The people in a hunter-gatherer band, but first of all, it's going to be very small because there's only so much food in any area. And that's also why they're nomadic, because once you deplete the berries or the game, you have to move to the next valley or on the other side of the mountain, or find the next creek or the next shoreline in which you're scavenging around for food or edibles. Well, once you have a constant food supply, like you have fields planted or orchards, now you can stay in place. And because you can stay in place, unlike the nomads who, you're the hunter, you're the doctor, you're the midwife, you're the priest, you're the scout, you're the warrior, you're the accountant, you're doing everything. Well, once you get into a city, now people can specialize because the farmer is growing way much more food than he needs. So now he can support other people. So now maybe he can support like military or protection for his fields or for his city. Now maybe there's a specialized person that intervenes to the gods on your behalf, and you pay them in like grain or meat offerings, and then they appeal to the gods for you. Now you can hire professional medical care or midwives if you need that kind of help. You can get someone else to make your shoes or to sew your clothes. And so it's also during this time that writing is developed. And at least according to our book, that is when civilization happens, when a culture is able to write down their history, their thoughts, their ledgers, etc. And so we have the rise of civilizations about 3500 BC in the different river valleys throughout the world. I mean, probably if you remember back to middle school or high school history, talking about the Tigris, Euphrates, river valleys, the Nile, the Ganges, the Yellow, the Indus river valleys. These were like hubs of early civilization, and there would be radiation out from that. And so coming after that, then we have a development from cities into like nation states and empires, but we're still in an agrarian model until about 200 years ago, or maybe a little bit more than that now, when we hit the Industrial Revolution. And then things change wildly, right? We have the steam engine, the internal combustion engine. And so in this industrial age, now there's a much bigger push in technology. And then the Industrial Revolution gives way to, some people would call it like the atomic age or the space age, where we now have technology that can take us to the moon or blow up thermonuclear warheads. And that's some pretty impressive technology for Homo sapiens. But now we are in a post-industrial, and I don't know yet what they're going to call our age when people look back on us, but many people believe it will be called the information age or the biotech age, because we are doing in biotechnology what our ancestors did with metallurgy. We are doing with genes and chromosomes what our ancestors did with ore and minerals from the mountains, where they would take bronze and tin to make iron. I think that's how you make iron or how you make steel. Anyways, it's a composite of different minerals in the furnace. And we're doing the same thing with gene splicing, where we're not just picking two animals or two plants and breeding them together and then choosing the desired offspring for their traits. We're now doing it at the chromosomal level with tools like CRISPR, where you can act, if you remember the old days with like the 8mm films or the strips of films, and the way you would edit back then is you would physically take like a razor blade or X-Acto knife, and you would cut out the frames you didn't want, and you would tape it back together where you wanted it to start up. Or if you wanted to insert a frame, you would take a clip from another reel and put it in there and tape it in. And that's basically what they're doing with the genetic code. If they, instead of having to crossbreed members of the same species to get traits, now they're genetically just inserting those traits into the animal. And so you can get like a one generational change in the species. And so that's so interesting. And so based on this general evolution theory, we would look at other cultures who didn't have that technology as less than or other than us. And anyone want to make any comments on that? Does technology really determine your level of development or evolution? Anybody?
I don't personally think so. Oh, sorry. I think somebody else was starting to talk as well.
No, you can go ahead. Go for it. You're good.
Okay. I was going to say, I think a lot of it is that we've been able to build upon what other, generations and people groups have already created or developed or.
Okay.
And I think that people are probably about the level of intelligence as they've always been, possibly declining since Adam and Eve were the most perfect humans. But we also have access to a ton more information that we've been building up. So it could be, I could see how people would get confused about assuming that we've been.
All right, thanks, Rhea. I know this is going to date me a little bit, but I love the old original Star Treks because, I mean, speak of secular humanism, man. That was like their underlying message. But they did it in these exotic foreign venues where they'd go to different planets. But they actually dealt with this theory in one of their episodes. And I was just a kid. I didn't realize this was actually a theory of anthropology. And it might have actually been the Next Generation or something. But let me just give you a brief picture of the scenario. If you remember the Prime Directive, if you're nerdy or geeky and like sci-fi, they weren't supposed to mess with or involve or change the cultures they were observing. They were supposed to be kind of like cosmic anthropologists, except now they're not just studying humans, right? They're studying all these other species of beings. And they found this one planet that had humanoid, they looked just like us, similar language, similar customs, but it would have been back in our like early agriculture or agrarian days as a planet. And so they set up like this high-tech duck blind where they could observe the village while they're in the village, but the villagers didn't know they were there. Well, they had a glitch in their technology and their high-tech duck blind came down and all the villagers saw these weird aliens or humanoids there observing them. And they weren't upset or shocked at all. In fact, they invited them in, fed them, asked what they were doing, what they were studying. They were very curious about them. And even though the Enterprise thought that this was a primitive planet of people that were way down on the rung as far as technology goes, I mean, these people have fire basically. They're not doing metallurgy or tools or things like that as far as I can remember. And the twist came at the end where the natives of this planet said, oh yes, when we were a young culture or a young race like you, we too went and traveled the stars and explored other places and studied other people. But then we realized we just liked who we were and our own home planet. And so we came back home and just decided to live a simple agrarian life. And I just love that, that example was some cultures may choose to actually live simplified because they don't see the technology as enhancing their culture, but rather dehumanizing them or taking away from their culture. And I thought that was a great, even though it was a sci-fi counterexample, I really like that example. Okay, the next guy, Julian Stewart, talks about specific evolution. He looked for more detailed explanations on why cultures develop in particular ways. And he saw these as through adaptation to the environment and the technology that's available. So for example, Julian Stewart would expect different regions of the world to develop different technologies. So obviously an island people is probably going to develop boat technology, unlike a desert people or an Arctic dwelling people or a jungle people, right? They're each going to have technology developing based on the resources available to them and their needs. And I think this is makes much more sense. Instead of saying, all people at all places, all times are going to go through these stages of like hunter-gatherer to horticulture, to pastoralism, to agrarian, to city-states, to empires, to industrial revolutions, to atomic age, to information age. He's just saying, no, in some times and places, they have the technology they need to live, thrive, and be happy. So why should they confuse things by adding more to it? All right, onward. Now I'm going to roll out to you. We're almost to the end of chapter 4, so you're doing good. But the authors want to roll out two main worldview pieces, and I love this because now it's more in my ballpark. It's more philosophical. And they make the distinction between anthropological materialism and anthropological idealism. And materialism and idealism are two ancient divisions in philosophy that go all the way back to the golden age of Athens, where we have Plato as the father of idealism and Aristotle the father of physicalism or materialism. And basically what Plato is saying, ideas and concepts are the most real thing. And Aristotle is saying, no, it's the physical material world that is the most real. And so we have these two different perspectives. So an anthropological materialist is going to focus on the things you can taste, touch, smell, feel, hear, see, all those physical, tangible things that you can physically measure, weigh, experiment with, and test. So they'll be looking at things like your tools, your clothes, your housing, your medicine, your food, all these physical attributes. But the idealistic anthropologist or anthropological idealist is going to be looking at your non-concrete things, like your beliefs, your values, your ideals, your hopes, dreams, fears, your religion, your philosophy, your music, your dance, your poetry, these more abstract things that you can't necessarily put under a microscope. And then, of course, we have a third approach called the holistic approach, which is saying, doesn't it make sense to not just look at either or, one or the other, but shouldn't we look at both the ideas of a culture, their beliefs, as well as their physical artifacts and tools? And that's a very postmodern way of thinking, right? That instead of either or, both and our book definitely has a postmodern leaning in that sense, where they're looking at both the ideas and the physicality of a culture. Any question on that? All right. I'm going to talk about postmodernism a little, because I know you hear that word all the time, but just in case you don't know what it means. Postmodernism stresses the relativity of all knowledge. In fact, it's so strong that it would say it rejects meta-narratives. Does anyone know what a meta-narrative is? Meta means outside or beyond, but it can also mean big or grand. And so a meta-narrative is a story that tries to explain humanity. And you could do that like through Marxism, explaining history as class struggle. You could explain it like a Christian, where you believe there's a God who created the world and he wants to reconcile humanity to himself, and he's given us guidelines to live by. You could do this as like a secular humanist or a scientist and say, no, we're physical beings, we evolved, we came from the Big Bang, and from the stars we came, and to the stars we will return. Those are all meta-narratives. And what the postmoderns are saying is, that's just like your opinion, man. That's your point of view, and there's other ways of looking at things besides a Christian lens or a scientific lens or an animistic lens. And they reject all these mega stories and saying it's too much to take account of, and it leaves too many gaping holes. So no one gets a corner on capital T truth, like absolute universal truth. We're all relegated simply to our limited human perspective and points of view and basically opinions. So this promotes the idea of relativism, right? Where, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans. This is how we do it in America. Maybe that's not how you do it in Peru or Thailand or Australia. But each place has their own way of looking at the world and their own narrative and their own truth, little t truth, but no one has capital T truth on how the world and humans actually are. I personally really like a lot about postmodernism and this aspect, because think about it. During the medieval period, Christianity dominated in Europe. They controlled all the churches. In fact, if you weren't part of the Roman Catholic Church, you were by definition a heretic or an outsider, because you actively had to choose to go out of the norm of your culture. So everyone had the same belief about where we came from, why we're here, how we should live, what happens to us when we die. And the church kind of controlled that meta-narrative of the Middle Ages. Well, when we get to the Enlightenment, that meta-narrative is being challenged, especially by science. And science begins to come up with a different hypothesis or theory about how we got here, how we should live, what happens to us and when we die. The postmodernists come along and they say, both of you are just giving us your version or your perspective, but neither one is necessarily true. They're just relativistic accounts for the world. And so science thought they had displaced religion, but then when we get to postmodernism, the postmoderns are displacing both science and religion and any other group that's making these absolute truth claims. Any questions on that? Okay.
Mr. Blackburn?
Yeah.
Would you consider like new spirituality like another narrative?
What kind of spirituality?
Like the new spirituality look like how you can attain a higher conscious through like drugs and all that stuff. I know we learned about it in high school as like a worldview, so I just wanted to know. Is it...
I would tend to think that it's super personal and subjective. And so each individual isn't going to say their experience is true for everyone else, but they would say, this is my truth.
Well, that's like the worldview is like, it's subjective to you.
Right.
And like,
and that's super postmodern. That would
okay. Postmodern. Yeah. Okay.
That would be a great example of a postmodern religion where you do you and you let other people do them, as long as what they're doing isn't messing with your stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually in California, that is the largest growing demographic in religion. If you Google like California demographics or religious demographics, Christianity still dominates. I think it's up close to 68% people would identify as Christians, but at least half of those are Catholic, identifying as Catholic, but still under the umbrella of Christian. There's as many Jews and Buddhists living in California as Southern Baptists. I mean, that's fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
We have so much diversity, but I believe coming in at 27% is the group called Nones, O-N-E-S. And this could be anything from atheists, which make up 4% of California, or agnostics, which make up another 4%. But that's still only 8%. So we still have 19% of people who don't claim any particular religion, but many of them still claim they're very interested in spirituality. And so that is a really large growing trend in California, where they identify as being spiritual, but they don't want you to call them a Baptist or a Buddhist or a Mormon or a Catholic. They just want to pursue God in their own unique, special way. And that's definitely par for the course for postmodernism. The next guy I want to mention is Levi Strauss. And he developed what's called structuralism. And this is an emphasis on the universal patterns of human thinking and how these patterns provide culture. In other words, what is the effect of the human mind on organizing the material world? And I love that type of thinking. It's like there's a raw world out there, but humanity has like this template that we're superimposing with our minds onto the world to provide meaning and structure. And so that's structuralism. Humans are bringing meaning and structure to the world. But you see how well this lines up with the definition of humanism. Humanism, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Protagoras, we have him rolling out, man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure. And that's kind of, we've come full circle from the ancient Greeks into the modern period, where many secular humanists today would also say man is the highest evolved part of the earth or life form that we know. So humans should be the ones to get to say, what is the good? What is the true? What is the beautiful? What has value? What doesn't? And that's definitely kind of the position the authors of our textbook are taking. Interpretive anthropology, an emphasis is placed on the uniqueness of each culture, a description and documentation of the various aspects of being human. And once again, this is kind of more into the cultural relativist camp, where you're simply observing and reporting. You're not making value judgments, saying this is a good culture, an advanced culture, a weak culture. You're not making those, you're just reporting on what the culture's about. And the authors in this book are definitely affected by the postmodern world we're living in. I think we all are to one degree or another. And so they're really going to try to go beyond either or type thinking. And the postmoderns, like many in the East or Eastern thought, are looking for a synthesis. So instead of talking about black and white, the synthesis would be gray. So, and gray is both and, it's black and white. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where the book's headed. They're going to try to find synthesis between idealist and materialist, between different cultures and different theories. And they're going to try to give you descriptions in between here somewhere. And that concludes chapter 4. Woohoo! Any questions or comments?
I feel like that also like relates to our church today, because like we have very like left-wing type churches or right-wing, and by that I mean like churches that are like very charismatic and based solely on spirituality, and then churches that are like solely just word-based. And like, yeah, so I just feel like that it's interesting how that's reflective of the kinds of churches that we have today.
Right, and so the ideal postmodern church would be one that takes scriptures seriously and learns and values the scripture, but also embraces the spirit, right? It's a both and. It's not like you have to have one or the other. And I think you probably see that among yourselves, even among your peers, where you don't feel like you have to choose anymore. You can have both. Why can't I have the spirit and the Bible? It's not like I have to swap one out for the other, especially if one is the author of the other, right? Okay, thank you. That was a good example. Any other questions or comments? I know that was a heavy chapter, and like I said, for the midterm, I'm going to list names or theories and then the definitions or their contributions. So you need to know them well enough where you can match up, say, Levi Strauss with structuralism, or Franz Boas with historical particularism. Okay, does that make sense? Good. So I would make flashcards if I was you, write the theory or the people involved on one side, and then the definition of it, what their contribution was on the other. And at least that's how I would try to get this stuff into my head if it was new to me. Okay,